Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 6, Episode 6 of our weekly P&Q&C&A&T series. That's podcasts and questions and comments and answers and talking for anybody interested. Link in the description if you want to access it as a podcast. And if you do, there's an extra hour or so of bonus content that you'll only be able to find on that medium. Just a quick follow-up to previous videos. I am now currently sitting in front of a fixed and functional new old computer.
I want to point out too, that so most people use Macrium. I use Macrium on the 3 other computers that I upgraded their hard drives to an SSD. And in this one, it wouldn't make a proper clone. It kept on having a read error, I think number 9 or something. So
yeah, whatever that means.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, it seems like a default kind of error for everything. So I ended up using another program, AOMEI, which was completely successful. And for Macrium, I even did, the troubleshooting that they suggested, like checking the disk for errors before copying it. It just didn't make a difference. AOMEI did it, no problem, completely successful. And the SSD was upgraded too after replacing that SATA cable, the internal SATA cable.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of shop talk for the specs, but long story short, I am back behind the device that I think at this point in my life I am most used to working on.
Right.
Which is nice. Yeah. So I mean, we were having some actually minor technical difficulties with the other laptop. With a little bit greater consistency than we were with this, so here's hoping,
Yep. Welcome back.
But getting into, yeah, thank you. Good to be back. Our first question of the week comes from Jared Lopez, and they ask, or they say, "Lol, I'm also taking an intro to ethics class this semester. Have you taken any other philosophy classes?" And I can answer that, and then you can answer that. My answer is no. That's the only class that I have, the only philosophy class that I have taken, and quite possibly I'm going to take in university. And it was actually canceled today because of the insane snowfall in the area.
Yeah, no kidding.
The teacher couldn't get in.
I spent an hour last night digging the driveway out. I spent another half hour this morning before work. And I got sort of a snow day at work. I came home a little bit early, and then I had to spend another 20 minutes digging out the row at the front that the plows had put at the foot of the driveway.
Oh my god!
So
yeah, we don't have a snow shovel down here, as far as I'm aware. So I just have to kind of walk through the snow out to the normal pathway. So there's like a I want to say 10-meter walk just in deep snow right now, where I just have to step into the boot prints left by my roommates and also me last time I went out.
That's nuts.
Yeah, it's not a great way to do things.
Yeah. Jared's question. I actually took philosophy, a full credit in first year and second year university. And I'm going to tell you, the sad thing is that they were my breadth requirements. I was basically like a biochemistry major, straight up science stuff, and I don't remember if they were my worst marks. They definitely weren't my best, but if they weren't my worst marks, they were my second worst marks. And the straight up science stuff, I was actually doing really well, like well to the point where, like ridiculous stuff. I must have told you the story where there's an exam where the class, the average is a fail, and they're chastising us in the lecture hall about how we did, and then we were supposed to go to the front of the class to pick up our exams. And I know the lecturer must have seen something in my face, because he started, "Oh, here, hold on, I think I recognize yours," and he was flipping through all the stack of all the failed ones, and he couldn't find it there. And thank God, I mean, I did really,
that was a
really
stressful
well.
time then.
I was.
That must have been really, really stressful.
Well, I thought it wasn't that hard. I thought I did well, but then if that's true, how did so many people fail it? I mean, I think I ended up getting like 98 or something, right? And it was close enough to 100.
Which is crazy.
Right. But then when they had the redo after they were explaining to everybody what they'd done wrong, I still only got 98, and some people actually got 100. Some people that had failed the first one got 100. I thought, damn, that really brought home to me the idea that the marks aren't always a reflection of the mastery of the material, but sometimes it has to do with just how careful you are during the exam and your test taking ability.
Yeah. So that's the answer to your question, Jared, and then maybe a little anecdote that you weren't bargaining for. Our next question comes from Jeevan, and they say, what feature would you like WB to add to the game? I think adding custom savable teamed offline and online to save time in editing gears and character combos. Also, gear loadouts being savable across all characters. That would mean you can spend more time playing the game. And I think I totally agree with both of those points. I mean, spending more time playing the game is the best reason to make any change to the game, and I think at the end of the day there's enough stuff kind of in the way of playing the game that it would be worth it to streamline it a little bit, especially when there's systems that are already meant to kind of limit the way you play, like energy, right? Energy is already a way to kind of limit the type of characters you're playing with, which I think is, you know, not at all a bad system, but there's definitely some stuff that I don't think is intentionally meant to slow down your play. Like, I don't think like picking gears and swapping out gears is something that would, in an ideal situation, slow down your playtime at all. That's not like a mechanic introduced by the developers.
Well, it used to be a different game too, right? I mean, your point is a good one where the energy actually limits your ability to play, but that's to drive you towards paying for energy recharges.
That's true.
But
I think it also serves the gameplay purpose of having you diversify your roster and get out of your comfort zone. And I think that's one of those examples where it's encouraging you to play a way that I would actually argue is more fun, which is having to swap stuff up every once in a while, having to try new things. And I think the reason why it gets a little bogged down and maybe swapping teams when you run out of energy isn't so fun is because of all the other stuff, like sifting through all your cards and then sifting through all your gear cards for each of those cards, that really make it a pain in the butt, and not actually the system of having to change characters itself as much.
I think the difficulty with analyzing the game like that, though, is that it used to be a different game. So it didn't used to have gears, so your gear loadouts didn't matter the same way. The fact that
they didn't matter at all.
Save them. Yeah, you can't save them. You couldn't save them because they didn't exist, and once they added gear, that would have been another layer they needed to add.
Yeah.
And swapping characters, there used to be way fewer characters. I mean, think of all the stuff that's been added because of the challenges, right? Most of the characters that were available, like, you could just scroll through it relatively quickly. They didn't used to have, like, 8 different Batmans.
Yeah, and it's become a little bloated.
Yeah, not in a bad way. I like to have options, but I think the developers have shown us, at least, that they're, even when it isn't an issue of income or like money, like purchases, in-game purchases, in-app purchases, they still are willing to do stuff that actually takes away from the game a bit in terms of rewarding you for not playing. Right? So defensive wins. All right, so the fact that you even get defensive wins and points for it is, I don't know, to me, counterintuitive to encouraging people to play. But then the fact that defensive wins are worth more, and I get it, defensive wins are harder because it's the AI.
Much harder, yeah.
But the fact that they give you more points for it, and it encourages people to want to set up defensive teams
that are annoying, that make people want to give up.
Yeah, and not in the Injustice that we played, but Injustice 2, which we no longer play, and people keep on asking us every once in a while why don't we, or we should. I mean, remember the missions that would lock away your cards so that you couldn't play with them?
Oh yeah, the ones where you send people away, and then there was a timer, and then you come back at the end of it for rewards.
Right. Like, I mean, it's kind of cool for characters that you don't play, but it's kind of crappy that there actually is that option, especially when your roster isn't that big.
Because it's a system for having you come back on a regular basis. It's not actually a system for having you enjoying your playtime anymore. And that's, I think, one of the problems with these kind of long-term, I forgot there's a term for them. Are they called lifestyle games? Where they're meant to, like, be incorporated into the way that you, like, live in your daily routine.
You mean like with a secret identity lifestyle, like Superman and Batman?
No, I mean like literally like they're supposed to be incorporated into your...
I know.
Yeah,
I know what you mean, but I'm thinking it's just a funny term for it because it doesn't really... You know how sometimes the name is kind of intuitive and it...
That might not be the right name. I'm not 100% sure it is.
Okay, so it's not... All right, yeah, okay.
But...
this is going to be interesting.
But the problem is they want you to come back, so what they want is concurrent players and... You know, they want people to keep coming back. They don't want people to be able to do stuff too fast, because when you have an experience that is limited by the number of hours that you have in a day, and not how, like, for how long a period of time, and by period of time I don't mean like all at once, but I mean like broken up over like months or ideally years you're playing it, is that it like this is a game that's meant to kind of appeal to a mobile audience and get like a kind of wide but shallow following, because if you can like check in once a day, you don't need to engage as much, and it kind of in that way penalizes people who have a lot of time and play games deeply and beat them and move on. Like those kind of mechanics are meant to keep their hooks in you a little bit,
right?
Where just because you have a couple hours to play and sit down, they don't want you to have a chance to play it and beat it or play it and become tired of it. They want you to come back every day, and even if it's for just 10 minutes, they want you to not forget about the game and keep watching the ads and, you know, have it stay on your phone, right? And just use kind of your attention is the resource that they're looking for, and it's worth more to have your attention over a long period of time than it is to have it in just a moment. And it's especially worth it when you have somebody willing to pay for in-app purchases, right? Because systems like that let people pay to bypass some. So they'll pay and they'll bypass some of the waiting. They'll bypass a week or a month's worth. They'll get a little bit ahead. But then at the end of the day, those systems are still there to keep even the people who are paying to keep coming back, checking in every once in a while. And then every once in a while when it gets annoying or when they want to jump in progress, to spend some more cash.
See, I can see, you know, they've put a lot of time developing the game, as in Injustice, for example, and that they want to get the most out of it. I think that at some point they can't. There's a limit to how much you can do, no matter how effective you are at getting your hooks into people.
Yeah.
There's got to be a limit before it starts actually working against you a bit.
I mean,
right? Because you get frustrated, right, with those kind of limiting mechanics.
Yeah, people do, but I think at the end of the day, the mobile game as a commodity isn't meant to be the most fun to people. It is meant to get the most money from people. And I think whether or not it's fun or frustrating doesn't often always actually correlate with how much money you end up getting from it. And I think whether or not a thing is fun isn't the thing that's making the decision. It's whatever their best guess is at whether making this decision is going to piss off more people to the point where they lose money, or encourage more people to spend money to the point where it's still a profitable decision for stuff like this. And I mean, that's not the way that everybody goes about doing stuff like this. I think there's people that put a lot of time and effort into games and then are totally willing to not have it get its hooks into at all. Like a lot of like short and sweet like indie games, right, really don't even ask for your attention for very long. They ask for like an hour or a couple hours of your time, and they say, you know, here you go, get in, get out, you can be done, right? Like, and in a lot of ways, I think games that have a good sense of how long they want you for and get out before it gets old do a pretty good job. But I mean, obviously we're still here with Injustice. Okay.
So when you were talking about that, it made me think of TV shows, where the TV shows that have a specific arc and they know where they're going, and when they're done, and they do it well, those are the best.
Yeah.
And then the shows that just keep on dragging on, like they feel, you know, it feels like they've overstayed their welcome a little bit, but they're just sort of milking it a bit.
Yeah, because they're successful and people want more, so they're giving people what they want, but at a fundamental level, they're just trying to cash in on their success.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally get it. Like, I mean, that's true. It feels like that's kind of a universal thing with not just games, but with a lot of media.
Yeah, and I mean, because we have a YouTube channel for it, I haven't really stopped thinking about Injustice the same way that I would about a lot of these mobile games. But I know there's a lot of like short indie games that, as a rule of thumb, do a better job holding my attention for in a meaningful way for a long time, even when I'm not necessarily playing them, even just thinking about them. Like Her Story has held my attention for almost as long as Injustice has, and I beat it in like 45 minutes years ago, and I haven't actually played through it again since, because the twists and turns mean that I can't even really play through it again. But it's managed to stick with me, not as much as Injustice has because of the channel, but much more than Injustice would have if it weren't for this channel, despite the fact that I would have put, like, you know, 50, 100 times as many hours into this game as I would have into Her Story.
Right. Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I get it. No, because I remember playing Her Story. I think I played through it, right?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
I hooked you up with it. I set you up on my computer, left it open. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure it doesn't stick with you the same way that it stuck with me.
No,
Or I
it's
guess
definitely.
I don't know if I can say that.
I definitely like, especially sort of that, not surprise, but a little bit of a twisty kind of ending.
There's a couple of twists throughout the game, which is surprising because of just the way that it's constructed. It's on mobile devices now, which is actually really cool.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, that's a good
Okay.
that's a decent way of playing it. I know it's definitely on iOS. I don't know if it's on Android or not.
If it's on Android, maybe I should spend some of my credits on that. I'd like to support it and maybe just take another look at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there we go. Our next question comes from Max Ramos, and they say, I read Between the World and Me from Ta-Nehisi Coates for my ethnicity and race, and I probably mispronounced that name. I'm very sorry. For my ethnicity and race in the U.S. class last year. It was very informative and jarring. Definitely worth a read. Please check it out if you haven't.
So that was in response because I think I brought up Ta-Nehisi Coates last time. I've actually got 3 of his books, including that one on my to be read list, to read list. I don't know what the term is, but because the thing is, I mean, I've seen read his articles. I've seen some interviews with him, and every time I read something of his, I find something that's thoughtful in a way that I hadn't considered before, and it just opens up my mind. And you know, as I'm getting really old, that's really hard to do. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it did when I was young, right? Like, you know, I'm a bit set in my ways.
3-second sidebar. Her story is on the App Store. It is $6.50 on the Google Play Store.
There you go.
Canadian, so not bad.
Put in some credits. Okay.
There you go. Sorry, back to that. I just wanted to look it up quick so that I could let people know who are watching this but don't want to Google it themselves.
So maybe my reluctance to read Coates, not reluctance, but just why I haven't bumped them up on the list to read faster, is sometimes I want to be ready for it. Like a lot of times when I'm reading, just because the day has been so long, I'm looking for something a little bit, you know, more just like empty calories kind of thing.
Oh yeah, tone definitely matters, that kind of stuff, because I think there's stuff that you can read whenever and stuff that you really have to be ready to read or in the right place to read, and you need to be like ready to think about it, because I think there's media that if you're not in a place to consider it properly, then it's not like the kind of initial consumption isn't necessarily the important part.
Right. Oh, so there was, as an example of Coates, there was one interview he did where he explains why it's wrong for non-black people to use the N-word, but it's perfectly okay for black people to use it. And he explained it in a way that made it seem, that one, made sense, but made it seem really, really obvious. Like, you know, like he compared, again, off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly how to put it because clearly he's a professional writer and I'm not. But he was talking about how, you know, there's other words like that where in context, you know, like the familiarity of calling somebody honey. If, you know, your mom called me honey, that would be normal. But if somebody walking down the street or at work called me honey, I guess that's not a great example because in the U.S. I think honey is used, especially in the South, I think it's used more with more familiarity, right?
Well, yeah, and I think that's an example too where just there's context where the just it's not necessarily the subject of the word, but it's also sometimes the person saying it. I think in that example, or if you come from the South or you're in the South, if there's somebody who acts that way just generally and it's really obvious and it's like integrated into their personality and you understand that, I mean, that definitely wouldn't apply to the N-word because I think that person would just kind of suck generally. But where separate from the context of who's actually the recipient of that, sometimes it's okay because of the person saying it.
Because honey's got no negative context, I think. But the N-word does.
I think
it's got a huge amount.
Yeah.
And
honey can be used kind of derisively or to diminish people.
Right,
it can be used as a bit of a diminutive.
But then when you, I guess that's true. But as far as the N-word goes, what people are trying to do, it's that there's a phrase for it. I can't remember what it was. Where you're trying to change
reclaim it.
That's it. Reclaim it. They're trying to reclaim it away from being a real I don't know, offensive racist term.
Yeah, there's a ton of that being done with LGBTQ people too. Where a ton of that terminology is people are self-identifying now because I mean like a lot of the words are like not, I don't want to say accurate because they have negative connotations, which aren't, but they're actually useful to delineate between people, and if they weren't offensive, they're descriptive, right? And so people are trying to use them in their descriptive contexts.
Yeah. Oh, I want to put in a plug just because we're on sort of on a related topic about how certain things are hard to, they're not as, that kind of revelatory moment. I don't get that often. And I want to give a plug to Ursula Gwynn, rest in peace. She's going to be sorely missed, but there was she did an essay recently. She published a book of essays recently called Words Are My Matter. And she gave a different perspective on abortion. And I'm totally pro-choice. But how the pro-choice, and I don't want to call them pro-life because technically, that's what they call themselves, and I usually am pretty good about calling people what they want to be called. But I hate that it's even though they call themselves pro-life, it's effectively pro-birth.
It's more like it's more like anti-woman's rights, like a bodily autonomy. Yeah,
so birth matters more than actual life, right? But the people get into these ruts where it's the same argument back and forth, and well, I guess that's a phone call. We don't want that. She actually put it from a different perspective that I'd never heard before about why having choice was important. And I don't, again, she's a professional writer. Clearly I'm not. So I don't want to ruin it for anybody who's going to read it. But you should read it because Ursula Gwynn talks from personal experience about what it was like, I believe, in the 50s, about not having the option, not necessarily not having the option, but not having it readily available, so that there was a lot of pain and stigma associated with not carrying a pregnancy through until the end.
Well, if we're doing shout outs to people who do a really good job of explaining left-wing rhetoric in digestible and interesting ways, I'm gonna recommend the YouTube channel ContraPoints. She's a trans woman, and she is uniquely poised to talk about a lot of trans issues that I did not have visibility of, and I think she was really useful to me personally. But she's also a wonderful argumentarian. She has a background in academia and philosophy, and one of the ways that her content is really, really cool is she kind of she brings it down to the level of the dissenting parties, which is something really cool. Like she talked about in one of her videos, one of her arguments she made, she was like, so I could make this argument and this is right, and this argument is based off of the assertion that trans women are women, but that is something that isn't necessarily taken for granted by the people who disagree with me. So although that's like correct and it would be a way to argue this point, it's also not going to convince anybody. So I'm going to take it back another level. I'm going to argue on their turf, and I'm still going to prove them wrong. And that was really cool, I think. Like she does a really good job of kind of addressing people's concerns in a way that I don't think the people on the left who don't are necessarily responsible to do. Like I don't think it's necessarily anybody's responsibility to kind of assume that these people that are probably arguing in bad faith are arguing in good faith and actually address their concerns genuinely. But she does a really good job of it, even though she doesn't necessarily have to. And I think she does a really, really good job of explaining a lot of stuff, and I've learned a lot from her videos.
Okay, so I'm going to say that probably the obvious reason why it's actually good to hear people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, ContraPoints, Ursula Gwynn, is that they're talking about things that don't always impact us directly.
Oh yeah.
And so we're not forced to. I was going to say we don't have the opportunity, but we're not forced to actually spend a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about it in ways where we can come up. It's like, I mean, the fact is we're in Justice Channel. In this example of our specialty, we've thought about the game in ways maybe more than people who are starting the game and who are looking for guidance. And I think that's a great example of just maybe the value of diversity, because their experience is different from ours. And so that they have something that can actually they can share with us that we're either not privy to, or that we don't, I was going to say we don't visit, like we don't spend a lot of time with, which is kind of cool. Yeah.
Very well said. Okay. Our next question comes from a mysterious Gir. That's Gir. And they say, I've been wanting to say I'm so grateful for this being available as a podcast. I have a daily 2-hour college class where I basically do nothing, and the school blocks YouTube. But now that this is available as a podcast, I can listen to you guys to pass the time. And I want to say right off the bat that we don't necessarily condone this behavior, but we're glad it's convenient. At the end of the day, we're not here to tell you to pay attention to your class or not. And I mean, honestly, there are some classes where, yeah, I agree, not a lot is going on, so it's hard to
all right, so what's funny
kind
about
of dignify it with
yeah.
your full attention.
This intersects with a lot of stuff that I've been thinking about lately about language and stuff, and I don't have any kind of expertise, and I don't want to even pretend that. But all right, so the first thing is I know that it's going to be almost impossible. Like if he's reading something at the same time he's listening to something and he's paying attention to trying to pay attention to both, I don't think from an information like taking in information point of view that you can actually do both effectively, even though they're hearing and vision, because they're tickling the same centers of your brain that handle language. It's going to be difficult. And I saw something recently where it is Twitter, so I don't know how accurate or true this is, but that babies, before they can formulate words, they can still understand language. They just can't say it because their musculature, especially in their tongue, is immature. So that they were teaching kids sign language, and these kids were able to tell their parents before they could even speak what they wanted, whether it was more of something, that they were tired, or they just wanted food, or they needed their diaper changed, and that they were less frustrated. And some were even claiming that they didn't cry at all, and by the time they were able to speak, they had a larger vocabulary.
That makes sense, because that's there's a distinction between language and use of symbols that's a little bit iffy. So people may argue that if they're not combining it in meaningful ways, or they're not using it in any ways outside of the context of exactly how they're taught it, they were more making use of symbols and actually using language. But the use of symbols is still kind of another layer of understanding and way of interacting with the world. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But getting back to the actual comment,
that's what I was gonna do.
Yeah, I want to say that other than the specific medium, I mean, we weren't specifically intending for people to not listen to college lectures and listen to our podcast instead, but the added convenience of being able to consume our content in a way that otherwise they would not be able to consume our content. That's pretty much exactly what we ended up putting stuff on podcast for. And part of the reason that we did that is it's the same way for me, where I was thinking about it, and obviously I don't rewatch our videos, right, in my free time, but if I would much prefer this in podcast format, and I would be able to get at it and regularly listen in podcast format, where I honestly don't know or don't think I would if it was a YouTube video that I had to sit down and play in the background the same way, where like a podcast really is the format that I would choose if I had to choose a platform to consume the content that we were making. And so it seemed like the logical next step.
Right. And we got to give credit, I think, really to iProphet actually for this, because as much as that's the way you consume your media, your podcast, we hadn't really been thinking about it the same way, because like you said, I don't go back to listen to our videos either, right? We have a conversation, we put it up, and then, that's it. But it was iProphet, one of our patrons, who not only, like a few other people had actually asked for it as a podcast, but the fact that he was one of our patrons made it, I don't want to say feasible, because it's not like we were relying on the income for anything, but made it more practical, something that was worthwhile considering. Because because we were supporting our fans, and it wasn't kind of it was a direct expense to us, but it was offset by the actual value that we're providing of supporting the people that are, at the end of the day, the people who are giving us money, right? The people who are financially supporting this channel. Right. Because what we expected to happen actually did, and probably in a bigger way than I would have expected.
Because, which is wild.
Yeah, I expected that there would be drops in views, which there were. I expected there would be drops in revenue on our YouTube videos, which there were. But the views dropped way out of proportion, I think, compared to the people who are actually downloading the podcast. along with the revenue.
Yeah,
and
it's weird because we're getting like 30. I think is the most downloads we have on any of our episodes. Let me actually check the metrics now. So we're getting a really low number of downloads, but we've also hemorrhaged views of way more than our download numbers. Our most recent podcast episode, that's a week ago at this point, has 14 plays, and 26 is our most played, which is our bonus content.
Right. So to me, my speculation is, okay, so just, talking turkey, right? So up until we started doing the podcast, we were making maybe about getting about 1,000 views on the basically the Q&A, the P&Q&C&A&T, or Q&C&A&T. I'm never gonna get that right. But so we're dropping about 500 views, and the income was dropping from maybe about $3 down to less than $1. And so it makes me think that those views, a lot of those views were people watching part of it, not being able to finish, and coming back to it later, but it was a small number of people doing that.
Yeah, and I also want to give a shout out here too, because I think it's only fair, because we gave one to iProphet, also to Anonymous B, who has been asking for the podcast for the longest amount of time and kept coming back with it, and also asked a question if we were going to make it a podcast, which we summarily shut down pretty brutally the first time around. We were very vehement. So I think Anonymous V deserves a little bit of a thank you here for believing in us when we didn't even believe in ourselves.
Yeah. So it's funny looking at the stuff, because if you're analyzing the numbers, they're still small enough that I think it could be just the natural fluctuation as people play and stop playing Injustice, right? But because it's hard for me to believe that there are not even a dozen people who are downloading the podcast now were responsible for 2/3 of
500 views. Yeah,
half the views and 2/3 of the revenue. But there you have it. I mean, this is, the numbers are there.
I mean, it's possible.
Yeah, it's possible. But, we're also comparing it to the peak when we were saying right before we started the podcast, when I believe it was around the time there was a new update. So the numbers were maybe a little bit higher. And this could be just the natural sort of slowing down that we see whenever there's no update, because the number of just regular Injustice players is still relatively small, and it's the updates that bring a lot of attention to Injustice in general, and I guess Injustice videos, which is what we do in general.
And at the end of the day, I think we have kind of reached a comfortable niche where we're not actually looking for growth, and obviously slowly kind of bleeding people watching us isn't great, but it seems like we actually have a core of people who are asking interesting questions and saying interesting stuff, where I'm feeling better actually on average about our comment section and our viewership, despite the drop in numbers, just because, even where we're looking at in this this Q&A where people are talking about like classes they're taking in university, books that open their eyes, right? We're having like, discussions that to me just feel more meaningful, to the point where I don't care if it's half as many people are watching. It seems like the people who are watching and commenting and engaging are only getting better, in my own personal opinion, for whatever that's worth.
It's definitely interesting. I mean, for me, like I said, it's never been about the money, although that's always nice, and it's something that you can't ignore once you start getting it. But it gives me an excuse to talk to you.
The money was just a good metric to look at how successful we were overall. It was it was not even the best metric, but it was a decent metric, and it's the kind of one that has the most real world ramifications.
Right. I mean, especially since, all right, so because you're away at school, and under normal circumstances, if we didn't have this YouTube channel together, we'd probably spend a lot less time talking.
That's true. Yeah.
And so we'd be a little bit less connected. And I'm always grateful to YouTube for that, if nothing else.
For fostering that connection. Yeah, that's fair. I think it's unlikely that we would have a lot of the conversations that we've been having, just because they're not really relevant to anything specific in real world, and they kind of just come out of sitting down and just talking about anything and everything for a little while. So I totally agree, and I don't think this is this would be exactly the nature of our relationship if I was away, and that's I'm glad for YouTube.
Yeah. Well, that saved me having to give you allowance, so.
That's true. That was many moons ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Our next question comes from Marty McFlew, and they ask, what new Injustice characters are overrated and or underrated?
Overrated, I think it's easy. The medals are the most overrated right now. Well, maybe not all the medals, just the first two medals. Nightwing is interesting because he's actually more difficult because his tagging and stealing power actually does make it more difficult to fight.
Yeah.
But, you know, the medals, all right, so maybe they start off with higher stats. Maybe they're a new tier of character, but non-hackers, they can't upgrade their specials or promote them without putting in a crap ton of time opening packs. And they don't have the Valorium to upgrade their specials or their passive. Hackers clearly do, but it's just they're not a problem. I mean, if I face a metal team that doesn't have Nightwing, I'm not worried. It's nothing. Like it makes really no difference in terms of the time that a fight takes.
Yeah, and I guess the problem for underrated characters is it's a little bit difficult for us to judge that because we don't actually keep up too much, and there's not actually a lot of discussion on the meta, right? We kind of just play our own way. And I mean, for the meta, I mean, we do keep up just in what's coming up in online battles, right? But that's not necessarily what people think is better or worse.
Right.
So,
I was totally agreeing with you, and then it just occurred to me that I actually have a couple candidates for the most underrated. Elsewhere Flash, who's the Flash with the lowest stats, and Containment Doomsday, who were part of our Q&A team for years. And there used to be a lot more noise online in the forums saying, well, Elsewhere Flash sucks, because he used to be in the Most Wanted pack. And he doesn't suck. He's actually pretty good.
That's true, but I don't even consider those underrated. I don't even consider those underrated because of how we use them so much. That's what I'm saying, is that my way of figuring out whether a character is underrated or not is kind of incompatible with us telling you anything new, because we've talked about characters that are underrated, but then we use them enough that, I mean, they're not underrated to us, and ideally they're not underrated to the people who are watching us and listening to us. And I don't follow any other communities, and really right now there's not a lot of that sort of like, oh, this person sucks talk going on to even figure out who we're using that other people think suck.
Yeah,
so that's true. It's harder. It's increasingly difficult to formulate the kind of counter to the opinion where we're saying, oh, this character is underrated, because for somebody to be underrated, we have to be listening to somebody else say they suck, and there's not a lot of that going on. Right.
No, that's true. That's not true. Oh, just want to point out too about the medals. Part of the reason I should mention again, because I mean, we've talked about it before, but may not be obvious to everybody. The other reason why the medals are overrated is because right now they max out at Elite 7. So they're level 50 Elite 7. So even though they start off with higher stats, they don't end up higher than a lot of the guys when the regular golds that are higher stats end up at 60 and Elite 10. So I just want to point that out again.
Okay, there we go. And we have a comment, our next comment from Lisa Peacock. And this is a response to our response to Drake Pendragon, and you're going to want to hold on for this one because there's a little bit of a back and forth that had taken place here. So the initial comment isn't necessarily indicative of where we ended up landing on it. So the first comment says, okay guys, your statement or comment on the second question just to me seems pretty naive. I wish the world was presented in the terms like you attest, but that's not the real world. The real world is much harsher. And then Lisa,
well, we asked her to be like
expanded.
Yeah.
And so Lisa says, in a statement that if I have in any way misunderstood, please correct me. In the statement that affirmative action is another way of discrimination is what I took from your comments. I can see your reasoning, but coming from my culture and background, I see it more as a leveling opportunity. I believe that someday mankind will reach the ability to judge on merit and content, but as of yet, that is not the case. And furthermore, if you look at the discussion as a whole, you're putting yourself in the, are you putting yourself in the shoes of someone who may be African American, Hispanic, or Asian to see how affirmative action may be different in their perspectives? Not that I'm passing judgment, just asking the question. And I think before we go any farther, we should say the way that you put things out here is totally and completely what we agree with. And I think we explained that in our reply to you, but that your stance is our stance, and if we did not have that come across clearly, then that is a failure on our parts, but not a failure of our opinions in relation to yours, because our opinions are pretty well.
Our opinions don't fail.
That's true. But if I wholeheartedly agree with the worldview that Lisa has put forward here. And then the final comment was, as I advised earlier, if I was wrong, thank you for correcting me. I do believe your outlook and your view is correct. People hear that word in it is a reactionary word, much like the N-word or some other negative stereotype. Most people would like to believe that they got there on their own. I just don't see that. Talking about affirmative action as kind of the idea that it's like reverse racism, which is I'm just gonna say right now, dumb. That's a dumb idea. That's not what it is. And this is actually super relevant to something I just read, where they looked at a study talking about intelligence scores using
where was
value. This was out of my psych textbook. So this is cited from some study, but I don't know what specific study, and I couldn't tell you the kind of holistic validity of it. But they were looking at a variable called G, the general intelligence factor, and looking at how that correlated with job performance. And the intelligence score had a 0.53 correlation. That's between on a scale between 0 and 1. So that was the single largest correlation, because it's over 0.5, it's over half, right?
So maybe for the viewers or the listeners, then 1 is a perfect correlation, so it's in lockstep. 0 is totally independent, random.
Yeah. So
this is about
if it's
half.
You generally don't get 1, because 1 means that
they're the same thing.
They're exact. Yeah, they measure what is meaningfully exactly the same thing. Whether or there's a third thing that's causing the other two variables. Those variables are perfectly correlated with each other, and if you have 1, you can exactly predict the other one.
Right.
But
it's like Fahrenheit and Celsius.
Yeah. So Fahrenheit and Celsius have a 1.0 correlation. One of them directly correlates to the other. It's like literally any function where you put something in, and you should be able to get exactly what the other value is.
Right.
But so 0.53 is pretty significant. That's more than half. And if you look at the other factors that they talked about, education is 0.1, and their how they interviewed is a 0.14. And certification, education, and interviews skills are basically the primary two things that you measure. There's almost nothing else that you actually do measure, because your resume is basically an indication of your education level and writing skills and previous experience, and the interview is the other major component. And both of these put together, it's a 0.1 and a 0.14, so that's about a quarter. That's and I know it's not additive like that. That's not how correlation works. But basically, they don't correlate super strongly with how well you perform. And there's a totally separate factor of kind of general intelligence.
So what is that general intelligence?
Much more valuable. See, I don't know the exact way that they measured it. That's the place that my actual understanding of the study failed. But basically, the point is that not only are education and interview skills not actually great indicators of how well you're going to perform, but also there are other measurable indicators that are much more meaningful.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So my take on it, that was cool actually, that your psych text just happened, you were going through it at a time when we were looking at this question.
Yeah, and I'm literally talking about going through it about half an hour before we started recording this. This was recently. I was literally reading through it, making notes on psych, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And I specifically put a note in my phone to bring this up on this video.
Well, all right, so what's funny is we're kind of, we're definitely Canadian, but we've kind of gotten Americanized a little bit, because one of the reasons I think why I have trouble remembering the phrase affirmative action is because it's actually called employment equity in Canada. And I know people make different arguments about why that's done, and I think if you pick the wrong argument, you end up alienating the people, or pushing away the people that I think need the most convincing. And to me, I was thinking, in what way does it make the most sense? Not that it's the only way or the right way, but to me, it's the fundamental value of it is that you're taking into account something, like you were talking about general intelligence, education, interview, right? How they correlate a little bit. Yeah. What you're trying to do is take into account something that was not only previously ignored, but was devaluing people.
Yeah, that's when I researched this previously for a project. One thing that was really interesting in the research that they found is that people, when you brought people together that were less similar to each other, their ability to problem solve was better because you had a wider range of backgrounds and experiences to draw from.
Right.
But something else that was interesting is that it also took them longer to come to these decisions because it's obviously easier if everybody's on the exact same page, if nobody's had any different experience, if everybody finds the same solution to the same problem. You don't have to talk about which one you're going to put into practice.
So you don't get to the right place, but you get there faster.
Or you don't get to as good a right place. The problem is that it's a bit of a sliding scale. So maybe you get a mediocre solution, or in some cases you get a really good solution, but you're getting a lot less solutions. So it's quick because you don't have to choose between solutions. You just pick the one that everybody thought of because everybody had the same thought.
Right. All right. So here's the thing. All right. So let's that diversity of experience, that is for a lot of situations, it's undervalued, right? So it's actually, I mean, in some ways, or in a lot of situations, it's actually discriminated against, right? That if you're different in some way, that it's held against you, and it really should be a positive, not a negative.
Yeah. I think part of that too is the world that you live in, right? Because I think the problem is when they're, especially the more explicit, racist or otherwise discriminatory sentiment is if you're in an environment in which is hostile to you, if you're different from the people around you and difficulties are being created. The problem is if let's use the example of if you're a woman, if you're the only woman that works in an office and you're constantly being sexually harassed and you go to the boss says, well, if you're a dude, nobody would be sexually harassing you, and they're pinpointing the exact wrong issue, right? Because the problem is the boss isn't wrong. An issue is coming across their desk, and the reason is that I don't even want to say the reason is because this is totally wrong, but one of the factors that is causing it, and removing any of these factors would solve the problem, is one of the factors is the fact that the person sitting across the desk who has been sexually harassed is a woman. But the actual factor that's significant is that all the people who are sexually harassing the person are sexually harassing the person. But if you're just looking at it from what's the easiest way to make this problem go away, it's not actually always the wrong answer to say, hey, remove anybody who's different, or remove anybody who is in a position to be taken advantage of, and then not be quiet, be silent about it.
Wait, no, that's not always not the wrong answer. That's actually, even though it's a difficult one, that's actually the right answer, I think, is what you meant.
I'm saying from the boss's perspective. I'm saying from when you're looking at it from just a pure numbers game, and when you have no sense of morality. Yeah,
so it's the easiest solution, but not the
right
right one.
I'm not going to say right answer. I'm going to say it is a very
expedient.
poorly.
It's an expedient answer.
Yeah, and it is to the wrong kind of person a justifiable answer.
Yes. It's like when if you were late for work or something because you stopped at McDonald's and had a coffee. The answer isn't, goddamn McDonald's coffee. The answer is really maybe make a little bit more time, or don't have the coffee, or don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of where you get the wrong, you get the wrong lesson from it. Before we were making this video, I tried to come up with examples of this. Like, a beautiful example is Moneyball. So that was the nonfiction book and movie that was made in a movie about baseball and how Oakland A's took advantage of on-base percentage as a stat that was undervalued. I mean, they started, it was an official stat starting in 1984, and it was undervalued, and people didn't appreciate it enough. And because of this undervaluing of the on-base percentage, Oakland was able to leverage it by underpaying for it, but then being able to stack their team with guys who could deliver, and they were quite successful on a small market budget because they were actually able to get this at a good value, although it's no longer cheap because more people recognize it as something important and useful. So I think, I mean, there's lots of stuff. Speaking of women, there was a study about orchestra auditions. I can't remember how long it was. Maybe like at least 10 or 20 years ago, where they started doing blind auditions for orchestras, not because of affirmative action or anything, but because they were afraid that there was a lot of nepotism going on, where people who knew each other were hiring like family members, and they weren't getting the best applicants or musicians. And what happened was they actually ended up getting more women than they did before. So it was an unexpected outcome.
But it was an unexpected plus because they were hiring the most qualified people for the job.
Yes.
And they weren't even trying to hire more diversely, but it turns out by removing any chance of bias, they were just doing better.
Yeah. And so, all right, so now we're at the end of our video, so we're running out of time, but I wanted to say that if we take the approach to employment equity or affirmative action in a different way, instead of talking about does this discriminate against white men, because that's the argument that some people are trying to make and have.
Yeah.
The argument I'm trying to make is that does diversity have value? Mm-hmm. And I believe it does. And you've got to recognize it some way to be able to say, okay, marks are worth something, the interviews were something. Well, diversity is worth something too.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I forget where I saw this, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but there was something that I read that was just along the lines of when you are used to coming from privilege, sometimes equality can look like discrimination because you're losing your edge, right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
nobody's gonna say that things are easy just because you are, insert majority group here, right? But it's right. All a sort of comparative scale where I think stuff is hard for almost anybody, almost no matter what your situation is. Even if you, for example, come from a lot of money, if you go to a really good school and get really good grades, you can't just buy that, right? You can purchase.
Well, you can sometimes.
You can't.
Depends on the school.
There are educational institutions where you can't purchase marks, and what all the money has done is give you every opportunity to work for those marks and not have to spend your effort working for something else to allow you even the opportunity to show up in the first place. You don't have to spend all that energy getting your foot in the door. You can just sit down and focus on being successful once you're there.
Right.
But nobody's saying that just because you are insert group of person here, you've had it easy, and nobody's saying that just because you're like insert like minority group, you've had it like objectively really hard, because somebody can be in that same really privileged situation in one aspect just because like separate from the fact that they have issues somewhere else, right? Somebody can be in a really positive socioeconomic position and still be a racial minority, for example, and it doesn't mean that person has had it crazy super hard, but we're just talking about kind of comparatively. If somebody else was in the exact same situation, if everything else were the same, but then they also had this difference, they also belong to a minority group, things are harder for that person, and that's I think really difficult to argue.
You're touching on the idea of intersectionality, right? Where it's not just one factor and one factor is all that there is. There's a whole bunch of things that has an influence up or down. Yeah. And, real life, you take into account all of that.
Yeah, and so affirmative action, I think, is I think the way that you have contextualized it is actually a pretty digestible way for me, too. It wasn't initially the perspective that I've taken, but in the weeks that we've been talking about it, I think you've sold me on it a little bit, where what using it is looking at kind of removing and counterbalancing those kind of comparative issues, where you can look at somebody's success and then say, okay, well let's try affirmative action is like, okay, so let's try to pretend we were working with a level playing field. We gotta kind of fudge these numbers a bit to get people to show their potential instead of just showing their success, because potential and success are two very different things, and a lot of potential is not shown just by looking at success.
Right. I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, so there we go. Well, this is a good place to leave it, but we also have to thank our patrons before we fully, turn off the lights, shut down the studio, flip the on-air sign to off. So we have to give a huge thank you to Console Peasant, Eddy G, and Edwin Felix, who are supporting us at the highest last word tier. We have iProphet, who is taking advantage this week of his Your Message Here tier. Oh my goodness, I have Oh, my list is not currently at my physical location, so I have to come up with on the spot what this segment is called. iProphet is taking us to his lovingly nurtured garden of guffaws, and with the following message: Why does Steele get so many traffic tickets?
Why does Steele get so many traffic tickets?
Because of his lead foot. That's a bit of a groaner.
Yeah. And for
Still
those
good,
people, I don't know if he's popular anymore. I just remember when I was still collecting comics, this was when the death of Superman and then a whole bunch of different Supermen came back, and Steel was one of them. And weren't they working on a movie where Shaquille O'Neal was Steel?
I have no clue.
Yeah. So definitely DC. It's definitely DC world. So it fits. So also we can't forget Shawn Farrell and Daniel Simonson, who are supporting us on the credited level, and Laszlo Georgiadis and Chris Wolf at the
Gratitude tier.
Yeah.
So there we go, and thank you to all of you so much for watching.
And
We'll see
listening.
you next time. Oh, and listening, watching and listening, whatever format you're taking. Some of you, at least one of you, is probably currently in class right now.
Please pay attention.
Just
Don't
a
let
little
your
bit.
education go to waste.
Okay, thank you all so much for watching and or listening. We will see you next time.
Komoda.